discussion on celibacy and waiting until marriage to have sex has become more and more common. Recently, we've been hearing from Devon Franklin and Megan Good as they've been sharing their own experience of waiting until marriage. And the movie Jumping the Broom highlights a main character who made this commitment before God that she would wait until marriage. And we've also been having this discussion in a previous video, The Truth About Sex Before Marriage. I have the link below if you haven't seen that video yet, but pretty much we discussed the reasons why it makes sense from a physiological standpoint, from a biblical perspective, and just a practical point of view, why it makes sense for us, especially as women, to wait until marriage to have sex. And you may have already made that commitment that you want to wait. You've made that vow before God. You want to honor God. And you're just not sure what's okay, what's appropriate. You're not sure about the gray area. You know that having sex before marriage is clearly against His will, but what about all the other forms of physical intimacy? Is it okay to kiss? Is it okay to make out? Is it okay to cuddle in bed together? Is it okay to sleep in the same bed together, or be partially naked, or even fully naked, as long as you're not having sex? How far is too far? Where do we draw the line? And I believe one of the first things to consider is, again, the hormone oxytocin. And we looked at this in the video, The Truth About Sex Before Marriage, and we found that oxytocin is released in its highest levels during sex and 10 times as much in the woman's body as compared to the man's body. And oxytocin causes us as women to be more connected, to feel more bonded with the man. It causes us to be more vulnerable and open and trusting. And it causes us to overlook negative aspects of the relationship and of the man and focus more on the positive aspects. So interestingly enough, this hormone oxytocin is not just released during sex, it's also released during other forms of physical intimacy, such as kissing, such as cuddling, such as making out. And the more time that you spend with physical bodily contact with this person, the more oxytocin that will be released in our bodies. So the effects of oxytocin will still remain even if we're not having sex, though it might not be as pronounced, but we'll still find ourselves more emotionally attached, and we'll still find ourselves overlooking the negative aspects of the relationship. And this is particularly dangerous if there are red flags that should be alerting us to the fact that this relationship is not what God has for us. But if we've allowed ourselves to be physically involved, we are overlooking those red flags. And it also becomes dangerous because if there is a breakup in the relationship, we're so emotionally involved and attached that the breakup becomes messy, and it's harder for us to detach ourselves and heal from that relationship. And I believe another aspect to look at in all of this is the so-called hot zones or pleasure zones on a woman's body or a man's body. And these are particular areas in which, when stimulated or touched, will generate a sexual response, will cause us to be sexually aroused. And it doesn't matter what mindset, what perspective, what commitment you may have had before, when you are aroused or touched in that particular part of your body, you will be sexually aroused. And I know that some of us may think we have it all under control, we know how to make sure things don't get out of hand, and we can stop things before they get too far. But the Bible tells us that if any of us think we stand, we should take heed lest we fall. Because the time that we think we have it all under control, the moment we think we're strong enough to resist the temptation, that's the moment where we're most weak and most vulnerable, and that's probably the time where we will fall. So we should never allow ourselves to play with fire. The Bible says, can a man take fire to his bosom and not get burned? Can we really play with the fire of sexual arousal and think we have it under control? We're going to make sure it doesn't get out of hand? The Bible tells us this is not the case. When we think we're strong enough, that's probably when we'll fall. That's when we're the weakest. But when we know that we're weak, that's when we're the strongest. And somebody who knows that they're weak will not play with this fire, will not allow for themselves to even be sexually aroused. And when we think about how Eve was enticed to sin, Eve was already by the tree before the serpent enticed her. The Bible doesn't tell us that she was on the other side of the garden and the serpent found her and lured her over to the tree. No, she was already there on her own. So it made it much easier for the serpent to deceive her and entice her to fall into that sin of doing what she knew she was not supposed to do. And I think it's a similar parallel with us and sexual sin. If we stay as far away from that tree as possible, that's probably when we're the safest from falling into the sin of eating of the fruit. But the closer we get to the tree, the harder it becomes. Now we're not just at the tree admiring the fruit. Now we've already picked the fruit. It's in our hands. Now we are holding the fruit up to our faces and we're smelling it. And before we know it, we've bit into the fruit that we said we weren't going to eat. And I believe that when we approach it from this perspective, instead of asking the question, how far is too far? When we approach it from the perspective of, how can I stay as far away as possible from falling into this sin? How can I honor God in this relationship and maintain my purity? I think when we approach it from that perspective, then the gray area is not gray anymore. Then it will become very clear what we need to do to make sure that we don't fall into that temptation. And when we think about what Jesus himself taught when he came to this earth, Jesus brought the requirements to an even higher level. Now, he wasn't just saying thou shalt not commit adultery, but he was also saying that if a man looks at a woman with lust in his heart, he has already committed adultery. So Jesus brought it to a heart issue. If we've allowed ourselves to be so sexually aroused and stimulated that now we are lusting in our hearts and that desire has now overwhelmed us and we are struggling with that temptation, that's when we've gone too far. We should avoid even the very situation that will cause us to lust in our hearts and struggle with that sexual arousal. And I believe that the enemy wants us to feel as if God is trying to deprive us from pleasure. God just doesn't want us to be happy. He just wants us to be miserable. But the reality is the enemy is the one who has come to kill, steal, and destroy. He's the one who wants to rob us of our joy and our happiness and steal the pleasure that God has intended for us. And God simply wants to preserve our happiness and give us life and joy more abundantly. But we have to trust his requirements. We have to trust the guidelines that he has given us and trust that when we are obedient to him, we'll actually be better off, that we're not missing out on anything. And for my husband and I, we wanted to approach our relationship from this perspective. We didn't want to approach it from the perspective of how far can we go. We wanted to approach it from the perspective of how can we make sure that we maintain our purity, that we don't entice each other sexually or be a stumbling block to each other. And we made a commitment that we wouldn't engage in any form of physical intimacy before our wedding day. And on our wedding day, when we kissed for the first time, our senses were just so heightened. We believe that God blessed us, gave us an extra special blessing because we approached it that way. And I think that Anyone can make that decision. It doesn't matter how far you've gone. It doesn't matter if you've crossed the line, quote unquote, already. It doesn't matter. It's never too late to make a fresh start and to say, God, I want to try it your way. I want to try a different way. I've done it this way before, but I want to try it a different way. And by God's grace, maintain your purity and your integrity before God.